talk first about this constant refrain we've been hearing from Donald Trump, Steve, that he inherited a catastrophic economy from Joe Biden. I think you should, first of all, analyze that assessment and tell us if that's true.
I think the simple answer is it's not true. The economy was doing just fine at the end of Joe Biden's term. There were certainly ups and downs along the way, but on the day Joe Biden left, the economy was growing at roughly a 2.5% annual rate, which is nice and solid. Inflation was down to around 3%. Unemployment was around 4%. Those are all healthy numbers. People were starting to have wage increases that were faster than inflation, so they had more purchasing power. Things were actually pretty good, and the stock market was certainly was higher than it is today.
Were there some things, though, Steve, when looking back on the Biden administration, he could have done better in terms of how he handled the economy? For example, there was that period towards the end of his 4-year term that people were really upset about food prices and grocery prices, et cetera. I mean, I guess how much could he have actually done about that? And should he have at least, as Bill Clinton would say, feel their pain?
Well, those are all good questions, Katie. So let's start at the beginning. Joe Biden's economic record was not perfect. I think we have to be honest about that. The inflation that did occur after the pandemic was a worldwide phenomenon. There was an equal amount, in some cases more, inflation in the UK and Germany and France and in the developed world. And I can get into why that happened, but it did. Some of it was a bit self-inflicted. We went out and enacted a bunch of big spending programs that increased the deficit and put a lot of money into the economy. And that does generate inflation. And so it contributed to the fact that our inflation rate did get up to close to 10% at its worst. And that represented a real loss of purchasing power for Americans. And so they were clearly worse off. Then thanks to higher interest rates, the Fed brought inflation down, and it went down, 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 and got to roughly this 3% level. Food, the way to think about it, there are two ways to think about food, or two pieces to the food equation. First, it's something we all buy, and therefore, if you have less purchasing power, then you're simply going to have a harder time paying that grocery bill every week. But that said, one of the things that when economists look at inflation, we tend to take food and energy out of the equation because those are kind of outside our control.
Mm-hmm.
For example, right now we have this egg problem. We had an
Right.
egg problem a couple of years ago also. And it has to do with avian flu. It doesn't have to do with bad government policies. It happened to Biden, and now it's happening to Trump, and it's neither their fault. It is just one of those things. And so we tend, and you can have bad harvests, you can have all kinds of problems that affect food. And so we tend not to blame a president for food prices. I mean, we do blame them,
I
but
was
they
going to
probably don't deserve to
say,
be
I feel
blamed.
like a lot of
Yeah,
people blame
yeah, they
Biden
do.
for
No,
him.
that's fair. They do, but they don't kind of deserve to be blamed. I think you take food out of the equation. But when you look at the prices of other things we buy, whether it's cars or whether it's home furnishings or clothes or whatever, general inflation, uh, we expect our government to be able to manage general inflation and keep it down at that 2% level. And we're now struggling to get it there.
Yeah, I think part of the problem was, I mean, my assessment is that Biden sort of poo-pooed the whole notion of consumer prices going up and didn't kind of acknowledge it and always pointed to more macroeconomic issues when people were talking about it. So I think it was almost a messaging issue, but what the hell do I know, Steve?
Well,
Let me ask.
it's a hard message. I mean, what do you say? You say, yeah, I created a lot of inflation. I feel bad about it. Or do you say it's not so bad? Or do you say, watch this shiny object over here? It was a really tough one. And the fact is that for the last 2 or 3 years, really, since inflation came down, as I said, wages, people may not feel this, they may not believe me, but wages were going up, have been going up faster than inflation. But when people feel so stretched, a president saying that sounds like he's out of touch. And so it was a
Yeah,
really tough position for
yeah.
Biden to be in.
Yeah, I know. Probably easy for me to say, from Los Angeles, what Joe Biden should have said. Let me ask you about, though, it's clearly Donald Trump's economy now, right? I mean, he keeps blaming things still on Joe Biden, but he owns it. And there was a bit of good news. Inflation eased more than expected for the month of February. So did that surprise you? And does Donald Trump deserve any credit for it?
Well, it eased this much more than we expected,
Yeah.
a tenth of a percent. So it's better than the alternative, um, but it's not. The problem is that we have been stuck around 3% inflation for a couple of years now, and that the Fed has said that 2% is the target, and Jerome Powell, who's the chairman of the Fed, keeps reiterating that, and so how the Fed's going to handle that remains to be seen. Everybody wants interest rates to come down. Mortgage rates are way too high. They're still close to 7%. But the Fed can't cut interest rates until inflation gets all the way down. Your next question, does Donald Trump have anything to do with this? No. This is a reading for the month of February. I don't think when you've been in office for a couple of weeks, you deserve either blame or credit for 1 month of inflation data. But now he owns it. And now he's going to have to try to get it down to 2%. And I think you can raise real questions about whether his policies are going to accomplish that.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about tariffs in a moment, but you say that the good news was teeny bit of good news, but people are not feeling very confident about the economy, Steve. As you know, according to the latest survey from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, consumers' expectations about their financial situation in the year ahead, quote unquote, deteriorated considerably. So talk about sort of consumers and how they're feeling and why they're feeling that way.
They feel terrible. They feel terrible. They have felt, look, first, put this into perspective. They have felt terrible for a good long while. And it goes back to the high inflation we had coming out of COVID and so on. At the nub of all this, people expect their standard of living to go up. They expect that, if not month to month, year to year, they're going to have more purchasing power. They're going to be able to afford more stuff. They're going to be able to go on vacation and so on and so forth. And we as a country have not been able to deliver that for a good long while. So yeah, they feel terrible. At the moment, they feel particularly terrible because they have been reading all the stuff about tariffs, and I'll let you get there when you want to
No,
get
you,
there.
you
But
can go ahead. I was going to move on to
uh,
that subject next, so go ahead.
but they're seeing a lot of stuff happen in Washington now that scares them. They've been told over and over again by uh, political people, but maybe more importantly by economists, that tariffs are a tax, that they raise prices, that they create inflation, and so that scares them. And if you actually look at surveys of how much inflation consumers expect in the year ahead, that number had been coming down as inflation came down. And in the last couple of months, with all this tariff stuff, it has turned back up again. And so when people expect more inflation, then obviously they're going to be pretty grumpy about the state of affairs.
Well, let's talk about this whole tariff approach that Donald Trump is using. I'm curious what you think. He cited William McKinley's Gilded Age tariffs as inspiration for his belief in their strategic power. I mean, he says he's being flexible. Reporters asked him about his inconsistent policies. So, what do you think about this whole strategy of using tariffs in this way?
It's a kind of it does go back to William McKinley. It's a kind of 19th century mercantilism. Donald Trump, uh, he has a pretty simplistic way of thinking about the economy and trade. He thinks that if we have a trade deficit, it's a terrible thing. It's like a household spending more than it earns. It's really, I don't want to get too deep into heavy economics, or we're going to lose our whole audience. So I'm going to spare you all that. But very few economists agree with him.
Is
They
there
think
anybody who agrees with him?
yeah, there's this relatively small group of people. I don't know, Peter Navarro, if you've heard about him, or
Yeah.
Robert Lighthizer. There's a group of people who believe, and there, I don't want. I'm trying to. There's a group of people who believe, and I, to a small degree, agree that countries like China are not fair traders. They've taken advantage of us. They've dumped a lot of cheap stuff on our market. It cost a lot of American jobs in parts of the country, particularly places like North Carolina or the Midwest. There's an argument around all that, but this is not how you go about it. You don't go about it by threatening, well, 25% today and now 50% tomorrow, but if you do this, I'll lower it to 35%.
Yeah,
Now
he's
he's talking
really
about two,
using them as a negotiating tool, isn't he,
but
Steve?
that's how he rolls,
Yeah.
Katie. I mean, that is how he rolls. He thinks it's all a big real estate deal, and the more you threaten, the more you try to apply pressure, the more you're going to get in return. And I don't know what he's going to get out of all this, but I will predict when it's over, he's going to declare victory and claim that he got enormous concessions. But look, let me give you to show you how kind of silly in a way this is. In his first term, he said that NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement between U.S., Canada, and Mexico, was one of the worst things that had ever been done. It was a terrible deal, terrible deal. I'm going to redo it. So he renegotiated into something called the USMCA, the U.S., Mexico, Canada Agreement, and pronounced victory. Nothing has happened since he left, but now suddenly that's a terrible deal, and we're going to impose more tariffs until they agree to stuff. And then he talks about Canada and fentanyl and immigrants. There are zero immigrants, zero fentanyl that crosses our northern border. And so what's happening is he's losing the confidence of not just the public, but the business community, the stock market. Everybody thinks this is all kind of crazy.
Who's going to pay the tab ultimately for all of this, toing and froing? Is it going to be the American taxpayer? Is it going to be businesses? I mean, who's going to be caught stuck holding the bag?
Well, kind of all of the above. We're all going to pay the price because obviously the stock market has had a really rough period of time. It's now probably 6% below where it was when he was elected. And so that's cost everybody from wealthy individuals down to the average person who's got a 401k or some other kind of savings in stocks, cost them a lot of money. It's going to affect individual Americans if the economy turns down, and I think there's a real possibility of that. Unemployment could go up, people could lose their jobs, corporate profits can go down, so it hurts companies. So the pain is going to be felt everywhere. There are going to be very few winners out of this, in my estimation.
I'm curious how you think people like Howard Lutnick and the Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, feel about this. I mean, they're pretty seasoned uh, financial guys, right? I mean, do you think they're, to use a phrase from my daughter's seventh grade, jiggy with all of this, Steve?
That's a new one for me. Um, Look, I have to believe they're both. Those guys are both, serious, accomplished people. They're not. This is not Kash Patel that we're dealing with here. And I have to believe that when they took these jobs, they knew what they were signing up for. And you never believe 100% of what everybody else on your team thinks, but they have to. I have to believe that they believe enough of them to be willing to go out there and sell it. And both of
Or
them have been very.
they dare not question Trump, right?
Well, look, the way, I've been in the government, and you've worked in large organizations. It's perfectly fair behind closed doors to tell your boss whatever you think. And in fact, good bosses appreciate being told the truth. But once you get out in front of the public or your shareholders or your customers or whomever, your employees even, then you have to be a team player. And so you can't expect Bessent or Lutnick or any of these people to go out in public and say, well, I don't agree with Trump about this, that, or the other thing. This is not going to happen.
Yeah, I wanted
I
to
mean,
ask you. I wanted to ask you the idea that the Trump administration is okay with this market volatility. I know you've heard this, even decline because it forces the Fed's hand to cut interest rates, and that would do a lot more for his core base of voters by lowering monthly payments on credit cards, mortgages, etc. That has been circulating in certain quarters, maybe in a lot of places. What do you think about that theory?
I think it's a fantasy. The Fed is committed to 2% inflation. And barring like a real collapse, like we had in the early days of COVID when the Fed aggressively cut interest rates, as you'll remember. I don't see the Fed cutting interest rates until inflation gets to their target. The Fed chairman Jerome Powell, who was appointed by Trump, ironically, back in 2017ish, is a very pragmatic, clear thinker. He hasn't handled all of this perfectly, but he's got another year or so to go in his term, and he does not want to leave on a bad note. And the market would just throw up on him with inflation still not down to 2% if he just started cutting interest rates. So I don't think that's their strategy. I think a little bit they're creating an ex post facto explanation for what's been happening. In other words, when they took office, they didn't say, well, there's going to be some pain before this all works. In fact, if you go back, Trump said stuff like, I'm going to lick inflation on day one.
Right.
And now the market's reacted. And so now they have to ex post facto come up with an explanation for this. And so now they're saying, well, yeah, there's got to be some pain. They're kind of trying to evoke, I think, consciously or subconsciously, Reagan. If you remember, and I know you're a very young woman, so you probably don't remember, um,
Very funny.
but the early days of the Reagan, when Reagan came in, we had huge, high double-digit inflation and interest rates, and it was even really Carter who started it, but Reagan and Carter engineered a recession to get inflation down, and then we came out the other side, and it was morning in America and all that stuff that you do remember, and and so Trump is trying to kind of evoke that a little bit now, and basically say there's going to have to be some pain, and then we'll come out the other side, and life will be good. But we're going to see how much pain. Uh, Look, there was a meeting in Washington this week of the Business Roundtable, which are all the big CEOs, and in public and even in front of Trump, I think they were well behaved, shall we say. But when you talk to them privately, and I was at a breakfast with a bunch of them today, they just want to tear their hair out. They just think that what's coming out of the White House is just gobbledygook and scary and just doesn't show that anybody's really in control of this thing or that they have any strategy. That one day it's this, now we're talking about 200% tariffs on wine and liquor from France. And it's just every
That's
day
going to
is.
really affect you, Steve.
I can survive. I can survive. We'll drink
Uh,
domestic.
well, I mean, there's so much to unpack there. Suddenly President Trump says he doesn't care about the stock market, right? When I think during Obama's administration, didn't he say when the stock market dropped that Barack Obama should resign the presidency?
Yeah, I know. Trump cares intensely about it. And the irony is that the stock market did very well at the beginning of Trump 1.0, as you'll remember. It turns out that at the beginning of Biden, it did almost exactly as well. In both cases, it was up pretty significantly in the first 75 days. This time, as I said, it's down 5 or 6% at the moment since the election. And Trump is pretending he doesn't care. Does he really care? I don't know.
Well, why don't any of those business roundtable, those bros, or hopefully there's some guys and maybe a few gals in there, why don't they say anything to him? Why are they afraid of him?
Look, I've met him a couple times. I've certainly never worked with him or for him, never would. I think they are all afraid. He doesn't convey a feeling of a guy who wants to be told the truth or be told or to get honest opinions. You get the impression watching him, he's one of those people who just wants to be told how great he is and be
And I
agreed
guess
with.
are they afraid of retribution, Steve?
Oh, in terms of the outside CEOs, yeah, they're all terrified. Absolutely. Look, you saw what he did with those two law firms, that one of which had represented Hillary Clinton and the
Right.
Democrats, and one of whom had represented Jack Smith. And this is a guy who does not take prisoners; he shoots the hostages. Everybody's terrified of him. Nobody is going to speak out. And I did a piece for the Times recently about how business was still supporting him publicly, but privately they have growing concerns every day.
You know, uh, John, John is sending me. Why don't you just come over here and ask Steve the question? Ask about. He said he's behind the scenes. Ask about Obama in 2009, the meltdown. Hank Paulson contrast. What? Just come over here now.
That was the guy that invited, a dialogue, and Steve was in the room for that.
Just come over here for 2 seconds. Say hi to Steve. He wants to say hi. Everyone
Yeah,
watching wants to see you, Molnar.
there he is. Hi,
Okay, go ahead and ask Steve.
Mulner.
Steve, I was just saying, because you have firsthand experience working in a presidential administration during an unprecedented time of turmoil and financial crisis. And you had a president that was sort of grasping for a solution to a really complex problem.
Yeah, look, I did work for Obama. I was in the room, certainly for the auto stuff that I handled, and I was in the room for a lot of discussions about the financial system and the banks and so on. And I have a huge amount of respect for Obama. He took on a job where he thought he was going to, kind of cure poverty and create racial harmony and peace in the world. And the next thing he knew, he was worrying about autos and capital requirements at banks and derivatives and all this stuff. But he just worked through it. He sat there, he listened. We had many debates in the Oval Office of different advisors who had different points of view, and he sat there and listened to all of it. And then at the end, he said, "Okay, I've heard all of you, and this is what I want to do." And then he made a very fact-based, rational, reasoned decision. And it has to be. I'm not in the room for these discussions, obviously, but it has to be the polar opposite of what's going on in Washington at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like it. Hey, what? Do you have anything else you want to ask Steve?
Good seeing you, Steve.
He's writing me notes and showing me stuff. I guess Jamie Dimon talked about how bad uncertainty is,
Yeah.
and I think that's what people are responding to, right, Steve? It's like he makes a decision, then he reneges, and then he puts it back, as you said. Like it's back and forth, and every day it's kind of a new position. Can you just talk briefly about the role uncertainty plays in making the market very volatile and the economy kind of screwed up?
So John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, had a saying which he called animal spirits, and by that he meant the economy doesn't just respond when the Fed raises interest rates or lowers interest rates or the government spends more money or spends less money. The sentiment of both consumers and business, the feeling of confidence, the feeling of certainty, the feeling of predictability, all play an important role. And what you have, and it was interesting because when Trump was first elected at 2.0, 2.5, 3 months ago, there was a very positive feeling in the business community because they felt here we have a business president. He's going to deregulate. He's going to cut taxes, and we had animal spirits. And people like David Solomon, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, literally used that phrase and said we've got it. Now we have the reverse of animal spirits. Now we have a president who seems out of control, who doesn't seem to know from one day to the next what he wants to do, where there's no certainty, there's no predictability, and so we have negative animal spirits, and it causes people to just pull back. I mean, we're in the investment business. Are we going to really invest in a company right this minute that maybe uses some imported products? Maybe it has a certain set of tax assumptions, or it sells goods to consumers. Uh, at this today, would we really go out there and invest money? And in fact, if you look at the numbers, you'll see investment activity has been very slow because who wants to make decisions when you have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow?
Right. And what about Trump's base and, sort of core MAGA voters? When do you think, or will they feel the pain of this sort of economic back and forth? And do you think that at some point they'll feel betrayed by a president they believed really cared about them and their economic station?
So there's a couple pieces to my answer to that. The first is one of the most remarkable things about the Trump phenomenon is that his base ever thought that he was there to help them. If you look back at what he did in his first term, the tax cuts were almost all for business and people in the upper half of the income strata. The deregulation and all that was to help business and probably hurt consumers somewhere along the way. There's really nothing he did in his first term that was really in their interest. The economy did well, but it also did well under Biden. And so now it's the same situation. The stuff that they're doing, when you start talking about cutting all the funding for all these organizations, the National Institutes of Health and public television and everything. It's not good for the American public. And on top of that, he's proposed another round of tax cuts that are not particularly favorable to people toward the bottom. And then on top of that, you've got Doge. And when people can't get Social Security on the phone to find out where their check is, when they can't get the IRS on the phone to find out where their refund is, when they can't get a medicine they want because the FDA doesn't have enough people to approve it, I think this is all going to go very badly for him. I just, the first term he didn't, remember the first term was kind of an accident that he won. Nobody really, including him, thought he was going to win. So they weren't really prepared. And so it was kind of a slow start, and then he did some stuff. This time, he came in guns blazing. You remember Project 2025, the blueprint. They're actually doing a lot of that stuff. They knew exactly what they wanted to do this time. And the effects have not yet begun to really be felt. But when they do, I think people are going to be really unhappy.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, just as somebody who works with a lot of CEOs, someone told me, oh, Katie, interview like a CEO to talk about just pure management, like how Donald Trump is managing the federal government. And I can't imagine any CEO saying he's doing a good job.
I have yet to find one. As I said, look, also to put this in context, to be fair or to be honest, the business community was not fond of Biden or Harris. They felt, and with some justification, that the Biden-Harris administration was really
And the
anti-business.
business community wasn't crazy about Barack Obama either.
They weren't. No, that's true. They weren't. But in retrospect, I think they'd take him back in a heartbeat right now. I think they think Biden was way over to the left, and I think Trump is out of his mind, and Obama looks like the voice of
Wait, you're
sanity and
shaking.
reason. They take him back in a heartbeat. But in any event, yeah. So there's nothing about the way this president operates that a CEO can look at and say, "Yeah, I feel good about that." That's how you run a country. It's just. It's just crazy.
Um, it's someone, well, actually, Courtney, my producer, do you think Trump has a red line with the markets? Is there a point at which the volatility could become too much and he'll reverse course again?
Yeah, I do actually. I do. I don't know what it is, and there's, what's that Hemingway line? How did you go bankrupt at first slowly and then suddenly? We could just have this drip, drip, drip where the market just goes down 1 or 2% a day for a long time, or you could wake up one morning and find it's down 15%, and you can just postulate a limitless number of scenarios for what will happen. But I think what will happen, I do think that if the market stays this weak, and certainly if it continues to weaken further, I think you'll see him start to moderate both what he's saying and what he's doing, and back off a lot of like this tariff stuff and get focused. He's got a big legislative package he's trying to get through and get focused on that. There's the possibility of this government shutdown on Friday if they don't reach some meeting of the minds between the Republicans and the Democrats. They need to get the Democrats in the Senate on board, and they're not on board at the moment. And so at some point, you got to believe Trump will wake up and say, all right, I got to pull myself together and actually sound coherent and act in a coherent way.
Real quickly before we go, you've been so generous with your time, Steve. Thank you. But a couple, I do this really for my followers and try to get some of the smartest people I know to put all this stuff into context. So some people are asking, what should people do with their money right now, especially if they're planning on retiring soon?
Look, if you're planning on retiring soon, regardless of who the president is or whatever, you should not be heavily invested in the stock market. Stocks go up and stocks go down. And you would find yourself in a position, you may find yourself in a position where just when you need the money is a low point in the market. I think the classic piece of financial advice that good financial planners give, and hopefully I'm in that category, is when you're younger, you should own stocks because in the long run, stocks do outperform cash or money market funds or bonds. But as you get close to retirement, you should be moving closer and closer into stuff that doesn't go up and down in value. And so if you're in that category, I would certainly. Now, I also want to be very careful to say, as I know Mulder will agree with me, that no serious investor believes that you can time markets, that you can sort of day trade markets and go in and go out and find that to be a productive and profitable way to manage your money. You invest for the long term, more equities when you're younger, less equities when you're older, diversified index funds, things like that.
Yeah. And let me ask you two other questions. I'll combine them. How does Trump and his team still not understand how a tariff works? And which industries will be most impacted by the erratic tariff activity? I have very smart followers.
Those are smart questions. How can he not understand? Uh, I guess the most charitable answer I can give is that there is a small group of people, including some people who actually have PhDs in economics, who do believe that. Look, Alexander Hamilton believed in tariffs when we were a young country as a way to protect industries we were trying to develop, but then you take the tariffs off when they've developed. So I'm not going to go back over 250 years of history. But in any event, you know, he's always believed it. He's a simplistic kind of guy, and when he's told there's a deficit, he assumes that's bad, and we should do something about it. And what was the other part of the question? Who's
The
going to
other
get
part
hurt?
is which industries will be most impacted by the erratic tariff activity?
Yeah.
Well, obviously the ones where we import most of the stuff, and that includes, for example, computers. If you look at the categories where people have estimated where the biggest price impact is going to be, the number one item are computers and electronics, because we don't make any of that stuff here really to speak of anymore. And by the way, let me explain one other thing to your very sophisticated followers. When you put a tariff on something that's imported from, let's just say, China, bicycles, it doesn't just raise the price of Chinese bicycles, it raises the price of all bicycles. Because if my Chinese bicycle was the cheapest bicycle and it cost $1,000, and now there's a 10% tariff or a 20% tariff, so it's $1,200, the people who make bicycles here are going to raise their prices to $1,200. Why would they keep selling their bicycles for $1,000 when their competitors' bicycles with the tariff are now $1,200? So that is why tariffs are a sales tax and inflationary. They raise the price of everything like it, whether it's made here or not made here. So the stuff that's going to go up is going to be the stuff basically that we import from somewhere else.
But I thought that he had reached an agreement with the automakers with the steel and stuff. So, because they implored him not to do that, right? But now they're back on. I'm so confused. I can't keep up with this.
I'm confused too. I think the state of play is the steel tariffs are still on, but he delayed the auto tariffs with Canada and Mexico for a month because, and this is going to get really wonky, and so you're going to cut me off. We don't just import cars from Canada or Mexico. In the process of making a car, parts go back and forth across the border multiple times. Sometimes a part will start getting made here, it'll go to Canada to have something done to it, it'll come back here, it'll go to Mexico, it'll get put in a car, and then it'll come back here. And nobody even really knows quite how to calculate what the tariffs would be under those set of circumstances. So they're kind of like figuring this out on, they're trying to build an airplane while they're flying it. They just are one step, more than one step behind at every juncture.
Well, I think everyone knows why, John, and I think you're one of the smartest people around when it comes to economic issues. And by the way, Steve is on Morning Joe, everyone. You can watch him. He loves his charts, and they're very helpful in understanding what's going on. I really appreciate it. You want to say bye to Steve?
Bye, Steve.
Bye, John. Have fun out
Anyway,
there.
thanks
Enjoy your
everyone for
grandson.
watching. And Steve, thank you so much for
Of
doing
course.
this.
My
Okay, good to
pleasure.
see you.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.